So the topic that I'm going to be speaking about today, I'm going to keep it brief. We have quite a bit of time to do question and answer afterwards, so if you have any questions, please do stay for that part. The topic that I will be speaking about today is women's rights, but specifically about this debate of universality. And I should start with a disclaimer, because I do think that women's rights is an issue, a universal issue. It manifests differently in different parts of the world, east, west, different countries, different cities, affected by more than just our faith. Politics, economies, histories, all of these have a huge impact on the way that rights, specifically women's rights and human rights, present themselves in a society. But specifically, I would like to take on a popular topic in modern discourse about this concept of feminism and its role in women's rights movements, particularly in the Muslim world. And I'd like to say that it is my opinion that I don't think Western feminism is an appropriate basis from which Muslim women should be deriving their sources for women's rights. So bear with me as I make my claim and my argument. And before I actually dive into the topic, I thought it interesting to speak about the goal of this conference, or at least the framing of the conference. The framing of the conference, where we acknowledge that all of us are coming from different faith traditions, explicitly acknowledges that we don't automatically assume that all of us come from the same values and ethics necessarily. You know, many of the religions around the world do have the same values, but they manifest differently in terms of the books that we follow. But it is, in my opinion, that using faith traditions as a way for the basis to present and human rights and women's rights is the best way to make these rights sticky in communities and societies around the world. People value their religion, their faith traditions, more than almost anything else. It's evident throughout history that faith traditions are what people will, in many cases, put their lives on the line for. And it is from this source that I argue that women's rights movements, particularly in the Muslim world, should not be taking their foundations from something foreign, and I'll be talking about some of the history of where Western feminism and why it's problematic for Muslim women to be adopting these values, or at least the history that is attached to Western feminism, but specifically why faith tradition would be a more valuable, more effective basis for which to argue for women's rights. And so to begin, just a history of what I call colonial feminism. Western feminism, as many of you may know, comes from a particular painful history that is no stranger to elitism, classism, sexism, racism, and oppression. Western feminism, how I've studied, I think that our moderator had actually mentioned that I attended Columbia University, but I attended the All-Women's College of Columbia, Barnard College, which is one of the leading institutions in the United States about women's rights. And so I was thoroughly inducted in this history of Western feminism and women's rights movements. But I found my way to understanding that while women's rights is a crucial issue that all of us should be discussing in every part of the world, Western feminism isn't necessarily the most effective way to do so. In fact, it actually has a history that, particularly for Muslim women, can be damaging to any progress they have made. And the most credible example and the most, contemporary example would be to take a look at Malala Yousafzai. I'm sure that many of you guys may have heard her name. She was a victim of a Taliban attack, and she became the Western media's sweetheart and an advocate for female education around the world. But what we fail to recognize is that while Malala Yousafzai's accomplishments and her hard work are without fault and should be applauded and praised, there is a very problematic way in the way she's being presented, and her work, like many Muslim feminists who have been claimed by the feminist movement, how in their societies their work is hindered by this attachment to Western feminism. And it's because it comes from a particular history of brutal colonization. Feminism has been, for the past 200 years, a scapegoat for colonial powers to invade countries, and not only in the Muslim world. I just have a small graphic, and in the two circles that are circled in the two areas on the map, this is just from World War II, and this is just talking about the US intervention in different parts of the world. And this is just from World War II, and you can see in the areas that I've circled, these are mainly Muslim majority countries. And in almost every single one of these interventions, the argument has been made that we must invade, not invade is not the word they use, but we must intervene to save these women. We are the saviors, we must save these women from their own communities, from their own patriarchy. And while their intentions may be pure, I have no doubt about that, the execution of this, in this manner has caused more trouble and more oppression than not. As has the case, take a look at Malala Yousafzai again. In Pakistan, while Malala Yousafzai is an example of extraordinary heroism in fighting back from the Taliban, there have been thousands upon thousands of Malala Yousafzais who weren't attacked by the Taliban, but by drone strikes, led by Western institutions who are claiming to fight for women's lives, for women's freedoms. And so, it is important to note that this is the basis for why feminism as a term, as a movement, as a theory, should not be applied to the Muslim world. It has too many painful reminders of the oppression of the past. Colonial feminism is a term that is very common in literature today, but it has deep roots in this world. There's example in the Muslim world particularly. There's examples of Sudan, Somalia, India, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, and most recently Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, where the same language is again used, where we're saying we're going to be fighting for these women's rights, we're going to liberate these women, and to do so, we are going to bomb them, we are going to attack them. So there's this quote that I felt really did summarize this idea, this contradictory statement, and it says, the idea of killing people to save them has always been a cynical way to manipulate public opinion then and now. The discourse around women's rights has too often been conflated with feminism, and it is to the detriment of women everywhere. Women, if we are true feminists, as I learned at Barnard College, you accept that women have the agency and the authority to define your own rights the way you'd like. You are not to be part of it. You're not to be oppressed by the men in your society or by the patriarchy of your society or the dictates of whatever culture you have, but neither are you supposed to be oppressed by some other form of women. And I feel like in this manner, Western feminism hijacking any kind of women's rights movements around the world has hindered the ability for them to progress. And moreover, this intervention, this military, economic, and cultural intervention in the form of not only, media and war has only hindered their progress or any progress furthermore. Got a little off track. But again, I wanted to keep this brief. This is a topic of of great interest for myself, and it's something that I continue to study, and I think I will be studying for quite some time. But the point is that while Muslim women shouldn't be taking advice necessarily from Western feminists, or maybe not claiming to be a feminist because of this painful history, there is a very large gaping hole in terms of women's rights movements in the Muslim world, and there is a need for Muslim women to now take control of that discussion, take control of that discourse, and move forward and progress with that. And so. Kind of went over this, and in doing so, I think that my recommendations, and it is in my opinion that as people of faith, this convention, this community, we all attest to some sort of faith. Like I said, faith traditions provide a set of values that are the most sticky, that are the most valuable for humans. They are the ones that humans will follow. You know, above anything else, you can convince someone if they believe in something that they will do it. And I think that for Muslim women, whether you are a man, a woman, or a child, any sort of change that will come from these communities must come from something that they value. And for that, in that case, it is Islam and the Quran and the Sunnah. That is, you know, while we have different interpretations around the world, there is no disagreement about the validity of these sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. And we must take steps back. And by we, I mean Muslim women. You know, I welcome all of you, men included. But of course, Muslim women need to take their role in this, need to take the lead in this, and take on the mission of creating this movement for ourselves. You know, if we want to call yourself a feminist, by all means. But the root of the word must, you know, still hold true that we have the agency to define the movement for ourselves. We have the agency to define the movement for ourselves, and we have the authority to determine our own rights and not be told what our rights are or should be or need to be by anybody other than ourselves. And again, that's my presentation. So thank you.